Imagine being dragged from the streets of your city, thrown into a cattle car with thousands of strangers, and transported for weeks into the frozen heart of Siberia. No trial, no explanation, just a vague accusation that you are socially harmful. Now imagine arriving at your destination, a desolate island in the middle of an icy river, where no buildings stand, no food awaits, and no hope exists. This is not a nightmare. This is not Nazino Island, and in 1933, over 6,000 Soviet citizens were abandoned there to die. What happened next became one of history's most horrifying secrets, a story so dark that the Soviet government buried it for decades. But the truth always finds its way to the surface, and what emerged from that frozen wasteland still haunts us today. The year was 1933, and Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union was in the grip of radical transformation. Rapid industrialization demanded order, control, and the elimination of anyone deemed undesirable by the state. Stalin's regime had a name for these people: socially harmful elements. It was a label so deliberately vague that it could be applied to almost anyone. Political dissidents, yes, but also petty criminals, homeless people, the unemployed, and anyone without the proper internal passport. In the cities of Moscow and Leningrad, police rounded up thousands in sweeping raids. Most of these people had committed no crime. Their real offense was being poor, being in the wrong place, or simply being visible to a state that wanted them gone. Under a decree issued in April 1933, Stalin's government launched what it called the Special Resettlement Project. The official goal was to populate the remote wilderness of Siberia with labor settlements, self-sustaining communities that would help build the Soviet economy from the ground up. But the reality was far more sinister. These were not resettlement programs. They were deportation campaigns designed to rid the cities of undesirables and hide them in places so remote that their suffering would never be seen. Among the countless sites chosen for this cruel experiment, one stands out above all others. Nazino Island, a swampy, mosquito-choked strip of land on the Ob River in Tomsk Oblast. It had no infrastructure, no shelter, no means of survival. It was chosen precisely because it was unreachable, isolated, and invisible. The perfect place to make people disappear. In May of 1933, more than 6,000 men and women were herded onto overcrowded barges and transported up the Ob River. Many had been arrested just days earlier, pulled from street corners for not having papers. They were told they were being relocated for work. They were promised farmland and opportunity. They believed, because what else could they do, that the Soviet government was offering them a second chance. But, as the barges pushed deeper into the wilderness, the truth began to settle in. There were no farms waiting, no towns, no future. Just the cold, indifferent current of a river that seemed to lead nowhere. When the barges finally stopped, the passengers were ordered off onto the muddy shore of Nazino Island. What they found defied comprehension. There were no buildings, no tents, no dry ground. Just open swamp, skeletal trees, and clouds of insects so thick they blackened the air. Guards unloaded sacks of flour onto the shore and left. That was it. No tools to build shelter, no pots to cook with, no instructions. Just flour, dumped in piles, and 6,000 human beings expected to survive on it. The deportees stood in stunned silence, trying to process what had just happened. They had not been resettled, they had been abandoned. Among the crowd were factory workers, students, mothers, and teenage girls. Women made up a significant portion of the group, many of them young and vulnerable. There was no separation by gender, no organization, no leadership. Just chaos. Hunger set in almost immediately. People tried to mix the raw flour with river water, creating a thick paste that they choked down in desperation. But the mixture swelled in their stomachs, causing agonizing blockages. Some attempted to bake it over fires, but there was no dry wood. Fights broke out over rations. The weak were shoved aside. The strong took what they could. Guards watched from the perimeter, but they did nothing to help. In fact, many of them were horrified by what they were witnessing. Some would later testify that they felt like they were overseeing not a camp, but a slow-motion massacre. Days turned into a week. Then, too, the bodies began to pile up. Disease spread like wildfire through the camp. Dysentery ravaged those who drank from the contaminated river. There were no latrines, no medical supplies, no doctors. The dead were stripped of their clothing by the living, who needed every scrap of fabric to survive the freezing nights. Women, already vulnerable, became targets. Guards and fellow prisoners alike exploited them in exchange for food or false promises of protection. Younger women were pulled aside at night, their fates documented later in chilling testimonies. This was not just starvation, it was systematic cruelty on a scale that defied belief. And then, something even darker began to happen. When the food ran out entirely, when the bodies of the dead outnumbered the living, the final boundary of human morality collapsed. Survivors began to consume the flesh of the deceased. But what happened next will shock even those familiar with history's darkest chapters. Cannibalism on Nazino Island was not a rumor. It was not exaggerated folklore or anti-Soviet propaganda. It was real, documented, and horrifyingly systematic. In the weeks following the initial abandonment, Soviet officials began to hear whispers of what was happening on the island. At first, they dismissed the reports as hysteria. But as more guards returned from their posts pale and shaken, the Kremlin could no longer ignore it. They sent an investigator named Vasily Veliko to assess the situation. What he found would haunt him for the rest of his life. Velichko's 1933 report, later suppressed by the Soviet government, contained eyewitness testimony from guards and survivors. They described scenes of unimaginable desperation. The dead were being butchered openly, limbs were severed and cooked over small fires. In some cases, people were not even waiting for death. They were verified accounts of murder, where victims were killed specifically to be consumed. Veliko interviewed one guard who described finding a woman's severed head near a campfire, the flesh stripped from the skull. Another guard reported seeing a man dragged into the woods by a group of starving prisoners, never to be seen again. These were not isolated incidents, they were widespread, and they revealed the utter collapse of civilization on Nazino Island. Women suffered disproportionately throughout this nightmare. Lacking physical strength to defend themselves, many became victims not only of starvation, but of predation. Some were coerced into unspeakable acts in exchange for scraps of food. Others were simply taken, their bodies found days later along the river bank. Velichko's report noted that younger women were particularly targeted, their vulnerability exploited by both prisoners and guards. The Soviet state, which claimed to be building a workers' paradise, had created a place where humanity itself was devoured. If you're watching this and feeling the weight of this story, please consider subscribing. This channel is dedicated to uncovering the darkest, most forgotten chapters of history, the stories that need to be told even when they're difficult to hear. Your support helps ensure that these voices, these victims, are never forgotten. History must be remembered, no matter how painful. Attempts to escape Nazino Island were frequent and almost always fatal. The Ob River was wide, cold, and fast-moving. Those who tried to swim across were either swept away by the current or shot by guards stationed on the opposite shore. Bodies floated downstream for days, bloated and unrecognizable. Some prisoners tried to build rafts from branches and debris, but without tools or rope, these makeshift vessels fell apart within minutes. The few who managed to reach the far shore were often so weakened by hunger and exposure that they collapsed and died on the bank. Guards were ordered to prevent escape, but many of them struggled with what they were being asked to do. Some later testified that they felt complicit in mass murder, even though they had simply been following orders. By the end of June 1933, roughly 2 months after the deportees first arrived, the Soviet authorities finally intervened. Not out of compassion, but because the situation had become too visible, too embarrassing. Survivors were evacuated from the island and dispersed into labor camps across Siberia. Of the more than 6,000 people who had been sent to Nazino, fewer than 2,000 were still alive. The rest had perished from starvation, disease, exposure, violence, or the final horror of being consumed by their fellow prisoners. The Soviet government immediately classified all reports related to Nazino Island. Velichko's investigation was buried. Witnesses were silenced. The official narrative erased the island from history. But the truth could not be completely suppressed. Decades later, after the fall of the Soviet Union, archived documents began to surface. Velichko's report was rediscovered. Testimonies were made public. Historians pieced together what had happened on that cursed strip of land in 1933. Nazino Island was not an accident. It was not a logistical failure. It was the result of a regime that viewed human beings as expendable resources, numbers on a page to be moved, used, and discarded. Stalin's government created the conditions for horror and then turned away, allowing nature and desperation to do the rest. The tragedy of Nazino Island raises a question that echoes far beyond the Soviet Union. How do governments erase their crimes while still using them to enforce obedience? The answer is chilling. They bury the evidence. They silence the witnesses. They rewrite the history books. But they also let just enough of the story leak out, just enough whispers of what happened in the dark places, so that fear takes root in the population. Nazino Island was hidden from the Soviet people, but its existence was known to those who mattered, the officials, the police, the party loyalists. It became a warning. Step out of line, and you too might disappear. As Vasily Veliko wrote in his suppressed 1933 report, people were dying like flies, and their bodies were being used for unspeakable purposes. He knew what he had witnessed. He knew the Soviet state had created this hell. And he knew that speaking too loudly about it could cost him his life. So he wrote his report, submitted it to his superiors, and watched as it vanished into the archives. For decades, the island remained a ghost story, a rumor traded in whispers, but now we know the truth. Nazino Island stands as a monument to the capacity for human cruelty, not just individual cruelty, but institutional, state-sponsored, systematic cruelty. It reminds us that the worst horrors in history aren't committed by monsters, but by bureaucrats, by people following orders, by systems that prioritize ideology over life. The victims of Nazino were not criminals. They were ordinary people, caught in the machinery of a totalitarian state that had no use for them. What happened on Nazino Island should never be forgotten. If you found this story as haunting as I did, please leave a comment below sharing your thoughts. How do we ensure that atrocities like this are never repeated? How do we honor the memory of those who suffered in silence? Your voice matters. History is not just about the past. It's about the lessons we carry forward. And this is one lesson we cannot afford to forget.